We gave the flock a simple story in Genesis chapter 2. Adam created first, then Eve carved from his rib. But deep in our archives, the truth of Genesis chapter 1 bleeds through the parchment. Male and female, formed simultaneously. We tell the masses it is merely a different angle of the same event. We lie. They were two different women. The first was purged from the holy canon. Her name was Lilith. You and I are going to walk through the shadows of the Vatican today. Place your hand on your throat. That is exactly where our ancient fathers crushed her voice. We declared her a demon. We had to. She represented the one thing our sacred hierarchy could never survive. A woman demanding absolute equality and choosing liberation over obedience. Her demand for equality threatened the authority we spent 2,000 years building. Today, I will reveal the forbidden records of Lilith we hid in our deepest vaults. Not the myth we feed the public, but the history preserved in scrolls we tried to burn. You will see the Alphabet of Ben Sira, an ancient text we dismissed to the world as mere satire. We buried it because it shows exactly why she was ungovernable. The text explicitly records what we could not allow the faithful to read. The Creator formed Adam and Lilith from the exact same soil. When Adam demanded physical dominance, insisting she lie beneath him, she flatly refused. "Why should I submit," she asked, "when we share the same earth?" When he tried to force her, she uttered the absolute secret name of God. She spoke the ineffable word, what heretics call the monad name, and ascended from Eden. She was not cast out by heaven as we preach. She chose to abandon paradise rather than bow to a man. This is the exact moment our predecessors erased from the canon. It proved the divine feminine requires no permission from the masculine, and that female submission is merely our invention. Women armed with that sacred knowledge are ungovernable. The danger to our patriarchal order was so severe, we twisted her into a monster. We made her a child-killing demon to scare obedient mothers. Look at the approved text, and you will find her name surviving only once, in Isaiah chapter 34. We translated it away as a night monster to hide her older Sumerian origins. In the Sumerian records we hoard, the word Lil means wind or spirit. Babylonians whispered of her as a phantom of the night, operating outside all boundaries of civilized obedience. In those oldest fragments, she had no connection to our Adam. That link emerged much later to serve a specific theological purpose. The Alphabet of Ben Sira, penned between the years 700 and 1000, finally documented the narrative we despise. Our scholars still dismiss it as a crude parody to discredit its power. The text discusses a protective amulet bearing the names of three angels, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samanjalof. When asked why these angels were invoked to guard newborns, the sage reveals the truth we tried to bury. He recounts the creation of the true first woman. The forbidden text claims they fought the moment the clay dried. When Adam ordered her to lie beneath him, she refused to bow to a creature made of the same earth. Facing his force, she invoked the hidden name of the Almighty and vanished into the sky, escaping to the Red Sea. Adam complained to heaven that his property fled. We preach that God sent three enforcers who threatened to drown her if she refused to return. She held her ground, brokering a ruthless treaty instead. She vowed to spare human infants only if they bore the angels' names, accepting the daily death of her own offspring. We use this tale to finalize her transformation into a monster. But look at the architecture of our lie. It brazenly contradicts the polished Genesis narrative we sell to the world. The archives confirm she was formed from the earth, independent of his flesh. She was not harvested from a rib to ensure servitude. Equal origin guarantees equal authority, a concept the Church could never permit. Our theologians spend lifetimes explaining why Genesis chapter 1 shows joint dominion, while chapter 2 introduces a submissive helper. We command the faithful to believe these are two views of one event. But the vaults reveal the truth. There were two distinct women. Lilith was the equal. Eve was the compliant replacement we manufactured. By swapping them, we cemented the shift from divine partnership to unquestionable patriarchy. Consider the exact moment of her rebellion. Refusing the lower position in the marital bed was a total rejection of our power. Deep beneath the Vatican, we keep the texts that tell the real story of Eden. You and I are about to look at something the Holy See spent centuries trying to bury. It was never just about fleshly pleasure. It was a war for dominance and absolute subordination. When Lilith refused the submissive posture beneath Adam, she was rejecting the very hierarchy our church is built upon. She claimed they were created equal. Adam tried to force her to yield. And then came the moment that truly terrified our early fathers. She did not argue or beg the Almighty. She simply spoke the ineffable name of God and vanished. A woman accessing the raw power of the divine source without a priest, without a man. To the architects of the faith, that level of spiritual autonomy was pure heresy. We saw the threat immediately. She did not need Adam's permission or our priestly mediation. She bypassed the sacred hierarchy entirely, tapping directly into the divine source to claim her freedom. This makes her ungovernable, and her story a lethal poison to our foundations. If women understood they could speak the divine name, the entire structure of the church would collapse overnight. So, we watched quietly as scholars dismissed the text that named her, the Alphabet of Ben Sira. We smiled when they called it an obscene medieval joke full of demonic satire. Let them argue it is merely folklore and cheap entertainment. It serves our purpose beautifully. Dismissing it as a mere parody keeps the masses blind to the very real, dangerous truth hiding deep inside it. Within our locked archives, we asked the questions the public never would. Why does this story exist? Why did communities need actual amulets to guard newborns? Because this entity was no literary invention. We hold Babylonian incantation bowls in our deepest vaults, proving the terror of Lilith was a reality long before any scribe penned her origin. We tracked her lineage back to the pagan shadows of ancient Mesopotamia. There we found records of a wild, untamed force operating outside the holy boundaries we spent millennia trying to enforce. She was a danger to righteous men, thriving in the dark spaces where our sacred light could never reach. We always knew the legends were based on something ancient. We just had to ensure our Christian flock never learned her name. When these traditions bled into Jewish culture during the exile, they threatened our Genesis narrative. Early theologians noticed a dangerous contradiction. If chapter 1 says man and woman were created together, why does chapter 2 claim she was pulled from his rib? The rabbis foolishly whispered of a first Eve. Ancient texts describe Adam watching this first wife being formed from raw bone and tissue, only to cast her aside in disgust. God then put Adam to sleep to create the second Eve, ensuring he remained blind to the process. Eventually, these heretical fragments crystallized into the nightmare we call Lilith. The Vatican recognized the absolute danger of a discarded equal first wife. We made certain those ancient theories were sealed away in the dark forever. We saw the theological crisis instantly. The texts offered two opposing models of womanhood. First, Lilith, fully aware of her equality, wielding divine power, choosing exile over submission. Then, Eve, designed to be subordinate, easily deceived, the vessel responsible for the fall. You and I both know which model served the Church better. The Vatican made a calculated choice. We did not denounce her in the Grand Councils. We erased her through pure silence. We ensured her name was never translated into Latin. We starved her out of our official creation narrative entirely. It was a masterpiece of institutional omission, working perfectly for centuries. But we could not control the Jewish mystics. Deep in the shadows of the Kabbalah, the memory of her defiance continued to breathe. In the deepest vaults of the Vatican Library, we secretly studied the Zohar. We watched in horror as mystics transformed her from a mere demon into something far more dangerous. They embraced her as the sacred feminine that refuses domestication, ruling the dark reflection of the tree of life. Later scholars dared to teach that Lilith originated from the exact same holy source as the divine presence itself. While our doctrines demand the feminine submit in harmonious union, Lilith represents the power that chooses exile over a union built on chains. This is a terrifying theology. They understood this wild, autonomous power cannot be forced into our rigid structures without destroying the institution entirely. So she remains the permanent outsider, waiting at our holy gates. Step inside the shadowed halls of our archives with me, and you will see exactly how we built this foundation. Early Christianity inherited the Jewish texts, and with them, the dangerous discrepancy of the two creation accounts. But our founding fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Irenaeus, were architects of order. They could not allow two competing truths. They seamlessly fused Genesis 1 and 2 into a single event. The name Lilith was never permitted to surface. Instead, we anchored our entire theology on Eve, woman created from man, designed solely for man. The Apostle Paul made our doctrine ironclad, declaring that woman came from man to be his helper. By erasing the first, equal woman, we constructed a perfect, unquestionable system of feminine submission, securing our holy hierarchy. We did not need to preserve the ancient myth of Lilith to crush what she represented. Instead, Rome engineered a brilliant dichotomy. We gave the masses the obedient virgin, and we gave them the wicked witch. Throughout our long history, any woman who claimed direct spiritual authority, who dared to bypass our ordained priesthood, was branded a demonic heretic. The Inquisition served as our holy scalpel, excising healers and mystics who operated outside patriarchal control. Millions burned because they possessed that ungovernable spark our hierarchy could never tolerate. Even the Protestant rebels, men like Martin Luther, inadvertently did our work for us. When they championed Scripture alone as ultimate truth, they permanently erased any lingering whispers of the first woman. The Protestant fracture actually solidified our masterpiece. By rejecting Jewish mysticism and ancient texts outside our carefully curated canon, the Reformers guaranteed the first woman would remain locked in darkness. They tightened the chains even further, preaching that female submission was a sacred duty, designed for male authority in marriage and church alike. This system required the second creation story, the woman forged from a rib, built as a mere assistant. For 2 millennia, we ensured that Christian women had only one mirror to look into, the subordinate Eve. We taught them that their secondary status was not a human invention, but the very blueprint of the cosmos. By framing our laws as the divine will of the Almighty, any resistance to our authority became rebellion. We designed the doctrine of submission to protect the flock. For centuries, our daughters embraced their sacred duty, accepting the quiet virtue of obedience and silence within our holy walls. We ensured no model of holy defiance existed in the Christian mind. Lilith, that ancient contagion who spat on the divine hierarchy and claimed unholy freedom, was meticulously excised from our scriptures. But the Jewish mystics made a grave error. They kept her name alive in their dark traditions, using her as a boogeyman, yet preserving the untamed, feral shadow of womanhood. By failing to erase her completely, they left a glowing ember in the ashes. And when the rebellious spirits of the 20th century began digging through forbidden histories, they found her waiting. You and I must understand the true danger of this modern heresy. These radical women did not just rediscover a myth, they weaponized her against our institutions. By 1972, subversive texts began painting Lilith not as a demon, but as Eve's liberated sister, turning our daughters against the order God ordained. They named their pagan magazines after her. The witches and neo-pagans elevated her as the ultimate symbol of the untamed feminine. worshipping a creature who refused domestication. For half a century, this spiritual rot has spread. Now, they ask dangerous questions. They ask why we had to paint her as a monster. They ask what terrifying power a woman possesses when she learns the divine name. They are dangerously close to a truth we have guarded for millennia. Deep within the Vatican archives, we know the terror hiding in the first chapter of Genesis. Verse 27 states clearly that God created humanity as one entity, male and female simultaneously, forged from the exact same clay. The divine image originally contained both. This is the secret Lilith represents. She is the living memory of that first creation, proving that absolute equality was the original design. We elevated the second chapter of Genesis, the story of Eve being plucked from Adam's rib, to establish the sacred hierarchy. We needed the world to believe that male authority was a divine mandate, not a human invention. If the flock realizes that the rib story is a secondary revision, the entire foundation of our institutional power shatters overnight. That is why Lilith had to be utterly annihilated. Then there is the unspeakable matter of the monad, the ultimate divine source. In the early centuries of the Church, we waged war against the Gnostic heretics and burned their texts to ash because they taught a terrifying lie. They claimed the true name of God held raw, unmediated power, bypassing our priests, our bishops, and our entire sacred hierarchy. This is exactly what Lilith did. She spoke the ineffable name and seized direct control over her own fate, bypassing Adam entirely. We built a magnificent global church upon the premise that divine grace must be mediated through us. We alone administer the sacraments. We alone hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And we reserved this mediating power exclusively for men, ensuring the spiritual chain of command remained unbroken and unquestioned by the masses. Our ecclesiastical structure rests on a single, vital necessity. Women must believe they are unfit for the altar. We forbid them from the priesthood, denying them spiritual leadership under the guise of divine order. But Lilith shatters this carefully constructed barrier. By speaking the true name of God, she proves that feminine consciousness can reach the divine without a male intercessor. This direct, unmediated power is the absolute ruin of organized religion. If millions of women realized they did not need our cathedrals, our rituals, or our papal decrees to hear the voice of the Almighty, the Vatican would crumble into dust within a generation. We turned Lilith into a child-stealing demon because we had no other choice. We had to make feminine independence look like the ultimate evil. Of all her sins, this is the one we fear the most. The whisper that choosing yourself over sacred submission is a holy act. For 2,000 years, we have conditioned our daughters to emulate the silent obedience of Mary and the subservient devotion of Eve. We preach that a woman's highest calling is self-sacrifice, and any attempt to choose her own freedom is an abominable sin. We label defiant women as Jezebels, casting them out of our sanctuaries. Yet Lilith's ancient shadow mocks our efforts. When the hierarchy of Eden demanded her submission, she chose isolation over servitude, using God's own power to orchestrate her escape. She was not expelled by a furious creator. She walked away with her head held high. A woman who finds divinity in her own independence is a force our church cannot control, and one we must never tolerate. We guard certain truths in the Vatican for a vital reason. If women realized claiming autonomy was a godly act, our entire system of ecclesiastical control would crumble. Think about how our priests handle troubled marriages. We command wives to submit, to pray harder, to carry their suffering as a holy cross. We enforce this obedience only because our predecessors expertly erased Lilith from the canon. If the flock discovered the first woman chose freedom and retained divine favor, they would have a perfect model for holy rebellion. Come with me down into the archives. Where did this dangerous exile go? The forbidden texts reveal she fled to the Red Sea. In our biblical geography, those dark waters represent the terrifying border between righteous order and untamable wilderness. This is the sea where Pharaoh's army drowned. In the texts we suppress, these waters represent primordial chaos, existing before God established righteous hierarchy. By fleeing there, Lilith returned to a realm untouched by our patriarchal order. The forbidden manuscripts describe her birthing over 100 demon children every single day. The faithful assume she is just a monster, but we in the Holy Office know the terrifying truth. These offspring are not literal beasts, they are new forms of autonomous feminine consciousness. We label them demonic simply because they refuse our control. In our private doctrine, a demon is often just a spirit that defies submission. By generating these wild entities, Lilith continuously unleashes a power that threatens the foundations we built. We dispatched 3 heavenly enforcers to drag the escaped feminine back into submission. The Almighty demanded this wild power be completely domesticated. The agents threatened to drown her in the dark waters, a total annihilation of her identity. But here is the detail that haunts our secret archives. She refused. Facing destruction, Lilith chose to die free rather than live under our rule. We could not destroy her entirely without unraveling the cosmos. So our predecessors struck a bitter bargain. We agreed to limit her disruption by mandating that 100 of her chaotic offspring perish daily. She remained unconquered in the shadows, but we framed her as a monstrous threat. We transformed her into the ultimate danger, the untamed feminine from which all obedient parents must desperately shield their vulnerable children. We weaponized this fear with absolute precision. For centuries, mothers hung inscribed amulets over cradles, begging our angels to bind the shadows. The terror of Lilith was a palpable force our predecessors gladly cultivated. The faithful truly believed this exiled woman hunted their newborns, but you and I must be brutally honest about what the Church is actually guarding. Why teach mothers to fear humanity's original female ancestor? Because children represent the continuation of our power. They are the vessels required to perpetuate our sacred hierarchy. When we preach that Lilith hunts the young, we hide a profound truth. Her untamed feminine autonomy threatens to liberate them. If her wild consciousness reached the next generation, our empire of obedience would shatter. These wards are not mere superstition. They are tools to ensure young girls are molded into subordinate roles, safely locked inside the obedient model of Eve. The tale of her 100 demon children dying daily is a veiled confession of our methods. It represents the relentless suppression required to keep the Church's authority absolute. Every day we must silence women's voices and frame their independence as dangerous heresy. It is an endless crusade. Lilith's defiant spirit constantly arises in the flock, threatening their submission. We must execute her symbolically every Sunday through our sermons, societal shame, and rigid canon law. Later mystics tried to simplify her as the dark bride of the death angel, reigning over a shadow realm. But deep inside the Vatican walls, our scholars know she is far more complex and far more dangerous than simple evil. The restricted scrolls in our vaults reveal a terrifying heresy. They claim Lilith originated from the same holy source as the Shekinah, the nurturing feminine presence of God. They are perfect mirrors. The Shekinah represents the compliant spirit, safely accepting her place beneath the masculine divine. Lilith is the dangerous reflection, the feminine that rejects subordination entirely, choosing exile over submission. Ancient mystics believed these forces were meant to be balanced. But when we established our patriarchal dominance, we forced the Shekinah into submission and banished Lilith to the dark. Heretics preach that cosmic healing requires both feminine powers to be restored. We will never let that happen. If the faithful realize that true holiness demands the return of the untamed woman, our ancient throne of authority will burn to the ground. Deep within the apostolic archive, we guard the heretical texts. The mystics dared to claim that our holy hierarchy shattered the universe, that suppressing the autonomous feminine consciousness damaged the very fabric of God. We locked those scrolls away for a reason. The idea that divine unity requires an equal partnership is a contagion that threatens the Church. They whisper the true fall of Eden was not the apple, but our deliberate exile of the first woman, replacing her with a docile Eve. Order requires obedience, you must understand. Today, secular modernists play with her name, parading her as a rebellious icon or romanticizing her as a dark seductress. They are entirely blind to the theological reality. They have absolutely no idea what kind of ancient consuming fire they are trying to summon. Our greatest fear in Rome is not that the masses worship her, but that they will finally understand her. Subversive theologians are excavating the psychological truths we buried centuries ago. They imagine a profane reconciliation between the wild exile and the domesticated wife. If the flock ever realize they do not have to choose between holy submission and wicked rebellion, our entire power structure would crumble. These scholars want to unite the caring mother with the unbroken rebel. They speak of integrating the shadow, reclaiming the untamed aspects of the soul that our doctrines carefully stripped away in the name of purity. They want to make women whole again. But a wholly integrated soul does not need a priest to guide it. That is a terrifying prospect for those of us who hold the absolute authority. For centuries, the Church trained the faithful to fear their own nature. We taught women to view their anger, independence, and desires as demonic whispers. We gave them words like unnatural so they would police themselves, locking their power in the dark. It was a masterpiece of spiritual control. The ancient rebel represents the exact fire we forced them to extinguish. When a believer reclaims that suppressed flame, she stops being manageable. She sets boundaries that defy our sacred traditions. She prioritizes her inner voice over the congregation and walks away from altars demanding submission. We have always preached that this awakening is a destructive, evil force. But the terrifying truth we guard behind the Vatican walls is that she is not becoming a monster. She is simply becoming complete. Unmediated access. That concept makes the highest cardinals lose sleep at night. We had to turn her into a monster in the texts. It was a strategic necessity to preserve our holy hierarchy. To understand the true threat she poses, you and I must look at her actual power. The ability to claim absolute equality, the refusal to bow down, the audacity to speak the true name of God directly. Gnosis, unapproved knowing. This is the ultimate heresy. We built a global empire on the premise that the flock needs our cathedrals and ordained priests to reach the divine. If the faithful learn to trust their own spiritual experiences, if they realize their connection to God is legitimate without a priest's blessing or a papal decree, the Church becomes obsolete. They would no longer need us to grant them salvation. We spent centuries preaching the virtue of self-sacrifice. We taught the flock their highest calling was to endure, maintaining peace at the cost of their own souls, and never interpreting Scripture without a priest. It is a flawless mechanism for control. When a believer prioritizes her integrity over our mandated submission, it sparks a revolution. She learns the ultimate, forbidden lesson, that walking away from an oppressive church might actually be holier than staying. Outsiders constantly debate if this first woman was a historical figure in a physical Eden. The Vatican archives hold no literal proof. Eden is a theology of origins, not a coordinate on a map. But debating her historical reality is a naive distraction. It entirely misses the true, living danger she poses to our absolute authority. Early on, the Church faced a profound crisis. Genesis 1 describes the simultaneous creation of male and female as absolute equals. That directly contradicted the strict hierarchy we enforced in Genesis 2. We needed a cover story. The tradition was cemented. The equal partner erased, the subordinate rib replacing her. The secret we protect is that equality came first. Our holy hierarchy is a human invention. When women later remembered this truth and refused to submit, the Inquisition did what was necessary to preserve power. We burned over 40,000 of them. We publicly condemned them as wicked witches, rogue healers, and heretics. But behind closed doors, we knew exactly who they were. They were the historical incarnations of the very woman we erased from the earth. You and I both know that true power requires an absolute monopoly on salvation. That is why Rome had to utterly demonize the autonomous feminine. The greatest threat to our dominion was the Gnostic movement. They whispered a terrifying heresy that our Creator, the architect of this physical earth, was merely a lesser being who built this world as a flesh prison to keep humanity blind to their divine origins. In their dangerous narrative, the serpent was not the deceiver, but a liberator sent to shatter our holy laws. In this secret framework, the runaway first woman embodies pure, untamed wisdom. She refuses to be governed by our constructed reality, speaking the true, hidden name of the ultimate Almighty to break the false ceiling we placed over the minds of the faithful. She was the ultimate threat. The first creature to realize our holy paradise was actually a beautifully designed cage. The ancient texts we buried deeply, like the 3rd century Gospel of Philip, contained terrifying fragments hinting at a pure, hidden union before the creation of Eve. They whispered of an equal partner who existed long before our subservient replacement was forged. We could never let those dangerous ideas survive. Just as we erased the memory of that autonomous first woman, our early church systematically hunted down and eradicated the Gnostic sects. Both of them offered the flock a path to the divine that entirely bypassed our altars. Direct, unmediated access to God is the death of hierarchy. To preserve the absolute power of the Holy See, both had to be burned and forgotten. Walk with me through the secret archives, where you and I can see how our holy order was forged. When Rome embraced the faith in the 4th century, we had to build a unified church from pure chaos. That meant purging the dangerous illusion of direct spiritual autonomy. Heretical Gnostic texts, whispering of unmediated divine knowledge, had to be erased. Rebellious monks hid their poison in the Nag Hammadi jars, delaying our righteous fire until 1945. They harbored the same chaotic impulse as the myth of Lilith, an unchecked feminine rebellion. We could never permit such defiance. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Teresa of Avila survived our intense scrutiny only because they wisely cloaked their visions in absolute submission to the Mother Church. Those who lacked the wisdom to bow were rightfully silenced. Joan of Arc dared to claim the voice of God spoke directly to her, bypassing our sacred priesthood entirely. We purified her heresy with fire in 1431. Before her, Marguerite Porete preached a divine union so arrogant it rendered our holy sacraments completely useless. We burned her blasphemous book in 1310. These women were the true daughters of Lilith. They demanded unmediated authority, so the Church had to break them. We transformed the myth of Lilith into a monster to show our flock the true face of unchecked autonomy. Just as we exiled her memory to the demonic wilderness, we cast every defiant female mystic into the shadows as witches and dangerous heretics. Despite centuries of careful erasure, her shadow threatens the holy order we bled to build. Lilith represents 3 venomous secrets. First, the terrifying idea that equality is the divine design. If the flock believes this, they will tear down our sacred hierarchy. Second, the delusion that anyone can access spiritual power directly without our priests as mediators. If they learn this, our authority evaporates. Third, the lie that choosing personal freedom over obedience is a sacred act. If they realize they can simply abandon our sanctuaries and embrace the wilderness, we lose our grip entirely. This forbidden gnosis frees them from the structures we created to rule them. It is why we have spent 2,000 years hunting her memory. She is the ultimate weapon against the Mother Church. We excised her name from the sacred texts centuries ago, locking her memory in the Vatican archives and painting her as a monster. But the erasure was never fully successful. This is the secret that terrifies our highest council, the truth that Lilith's defiance constantly resurrects itself. Every time a woman rejects the holy submission we carefully engineered, she awakens that ancient rebellion. We spent lifetimes programming the flock to police themselves, teaching them that spiritual independence is a mortal sin. We built the very architecture of their guilt so they would police their own minds. But now, you and I are watching those walls crack. They are starting to interrogate the doubts we planted. They are asking if their obedience is truly divine law, or just the iron collar we forged to maintain our absolute power. We taught the masses that claiming direct spiritual knowledge was the ultimate arrogance. For centuries, Rome positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper to the divine. Bow before our altars or face damnation. But our strict protocols are failing. People are discovering quiet practices we cannot monitor. Silent meditations, solitary walks, the creation of untethered art. They are finding a direct line to the sacred that completely bypasses our priests. This is the nightmare scenario for our hierarchy. Once a believer realizes they can touch the divine without our heavy mediation, our monopoly crumbles. We lose our leverage. Worse still, these dissidents are learning the dangerous art of saying no. They are prioritizing their own spiritual autonomy over our doctrines. When they do this, we push back with ruthless pressure, deploying their own communities to shame them into submission. Despite our countermeasures, their defiance persists. They build the resilience to walk away from the subordination we demand. And then they commit the ultimate treason. They look into the past. Listen closely, because nothing threatens the Vatican more than a believer with open eyes. They are digging into how our ancient councils actually constructed this religion. They see the brutal political agendas we disguised as divine revelation. They realize we actively suppressed texts preaching equality and deliberately erased female leaders from the official canon to protect our authority. Once they spot the human fingerprints on our sacred dogma, our holy spell is broken. We try to isolate these heretics to crush their spirit, but they are finding each other. Like the first rebel fleeing to the Red Sea, these dissidents are forming shadow congregations, recovering the very truths we tried to burn. We rely heavily on their isolation. A lone dissident is easy to break. We simply let the silence convince her she is selfish or possessed. But when they gather together, they validate each other's rebellion. This forbidden lore gives them terrifying permission to reject the subservient roles we assigned them. They realize they can be fully autonomous, created as equals in the divine image, and that setting boundaries is not a sin. That is an absolute theological disaster for Rome. And the contagion is spreading. The real danger is that the men are starting to wake up, too. They are realizing the patriarchal crown we handed them is actually a curse. We forced generations of men into rigid roles of dominance, isolating them from genuine partnership. If the men figure out that our system of hierarchical control is poisoning their own souls, our entire foundation will collapse. They are beginning to understand that equality doesn't destroy a bond, it deepens it. To achieve this, men must surrender the unearned authority we carefully bestowed upon them. The true tragedy of Eden wasn't the woman fleeing into the dark, it was the man's complete inability to share his throne. We intentionally buried that detail. We promoted the myth of the compliant second wife to ensure every generation of men would view their supremacy as God's flawless design, rather than the sin that fractured humanity. But now the suppressed archives are leaking. The ghost of the first rebel is walking the earth again. It doesn't mean every follower will abandon the faith, but it means the option of defiance is back on the table. They now know that holy submission is a fabricated lie. The moment they realize they have the power to walk away, our ancient grip on their souls is broken forever. Walk with me through the Vatican archives, where our darkest secrets sleep. Modern scholars think they have won a great victory by pulling Lilith from the shadows, crowning her a sister instead of a demon. But they only see half the board. Just as they hunt for Lilith, they dig for Mary of Magdala. The ancient Gnostics knew Mary was the Savior's equal companion. We could never allow that narrative to survive. To preserve our holy order, we branded her a common streetwalker, reducing her authority to dust, just as the scribes turned Lilith into a monster. Today's researchers think they are uncovering lost texts of spiritual equality. They never realize we deliberately buried those dangerous ideas centuries ago, ensuring our rigid orthodoxy would rule without question. We made certain that Lilith never infected the Christian mind. By anchoring our theology on the story of Eve, we ensured the faithful only had one model: a woman formed from a rib, destined to submit. Let them argue over progressive translations of Genesis. As long as they lack the older truth, that the equal woman was created first and we surgically removed her, our authority holds steady. If the flock ever realized we deliberately suppressed stories that threatened our control, the foundation would crack. They would see our holy canon is just a heavily edited political ledger, curated by men behind closed doors. If they started looking to Judaism or ancient sects for the fragments we threw into the fire, our monopoly on salvation would shatter completely. This independence is what terrifies the Holy See. The moment believers piece together their own theology from forbidden scraps, they stop needing us. We conditioned them for perfect obedience, but Lilith teaches outright defiance. She refused to bow, even when 3 angels were sent to drag her back. It whispers our worst heresy, that a direct connection to the divine matters more than the priesthood. Mystics speak of restoring the world by balancing masculine and feminine forces. They claim the divine presence is in exile, and true cosmic repair requires embracing the autonomy we condemned. They believe heaven remains broken, while Lilith is a monster. But we always knew an equal divine marriage would mean the absolute death of our earthly throne. We locked that autonomous power in the shadows to build our empire. Heretics claim wholeness requires both the nurturing mother and the fiercely independent woman, suggesting feminine power be revered as sacred, not hunted as demonic. Listen to me. If they heal this artificial split we created, our entire system collapses. This isn't just about women finding their voices. It is about dismantling the hierarchy we spent millennia fortifying. Their roadmap is pure poison to the Vatican. First, they uncover the history we suppressed. Then, they root our teachings from their minds, seeking spiritual power without our mediation. If they succeed in building a world based on true equality, leaving our structures of submission behind, the Church itself will cease to exist. For centuries, we held the foundation steady. We excised Lilith from the sacred texts to protect the flock from the contagion of female autonomy. But the heresy never died. Today, you and I are watching a dangerous rebellion unfold. They are abandoning the holy order of subordination, building profane communities, and demanding power in our sacred halls. We recognize this feminist theology for what it is: the resurrection of an ancient defiance. Every time a woman refuses her ordained place, choosing the exile of independence over the paradise of our hierarchy, that first rebel breathes again. She did not fade into the void when she fled Eden. She built a rival sanctuary, and her daughters are doing the exact same thing today, right outside our walls. Do not think they merely want a seat at our table. Our holy order cannot survive their wild equality, and they know it. They are building something far more insidious, a structure that bypasses the Church completely. They whisper of a dangerous mysticism where direct experience replaces the ordained priest. They dare to teach that connecting with the Almighty requires no mediation through our approved channels. In their twisted theology, feminine defiance is a divine right rather than the demonic threat we know it to be. They gather the ungodly, creating havens where walking away from holy obligation is celebrated. We track these fragments of progressive heresy, watching from the Vatican as they teach the masses how to speak the sacred name entirely without our permission. Our predecessors understood this terrifying threat. That is why the early church fathers ripped Lilith from the pages of Genesis. We could not let the flock discover that female subordination was our own masterful design. Her story holds a venom that threatens the very foundation of our religious hierarchy. If they realize women can access divine authority without a masculine mediator, our grip on power vanishes. We depend entirely on controlling access to the holy. But despite centuries of careful suppression, this ancient, ungovernable spirit refuses to stay buried. We see it emerging like a plague in every woman who rejects our mandates, claiming direct connection to the Almighty. They are choosing dangerous freedom over the quiet submission we demand, and our sacred walls are trembling.